At first light, the camp should have been waking up. Instead, it was empty. No voices, no movement, no smoke rising from cooking fires. Just abandoned gear scattered across a forest clearing in 1944 Europe. Rifles leaning against trees, packs half open, helmets resting where men had dropped them only hours before. Boot prints led away from the site in multiple directions, disappearing into the trees. No signs of a firefight, no bodies, no prisoners. The Americans were simply gone. The unit had arrived late the night before, exhausted from days of movement through contested territory. The location was meant to be temporary, a stop to rest, regroup, and move again at dawn. It was not a fortified position, just a clearing tucked into dense woods, chosen because it offered concealment rather than strength. They had posted guards, they had followed procedure, they had gone to sleep expecting morning. When the first friendly patrol reached the site after sunrise, they expected to find men packing up, cursing the cold, brewing weak coffee. What they found instead felt wrong immediately, too quiet, too still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The clearing told a story, but not one anyone understood yet. Equipment had been left behind deliberately, not dropped in panic. Weapons were not scattered wildly. There were no shell craters, no blood trails, no broken branches suggesting a sudden attack. The fire pit still held embers, cold but undisturbed. Rations were untouched. This was not an ambush. Something else had happened. Officers moved carefully through the site, taking notes, marking tracks, ordering silence. Footprints led toward the trees in loose groups, not a single column. Some tracks overlapped, others doubled back. It looked less like men fleeing, and more like men being guided away, quietly under control. That possibility unsettled everyone. German units were known to operate nearby, night patrols, recon elements, units skilled in infiltration and deception. But even so, the idea that an entire American unit could vanish without a sound, without resistance, without leaving evidence behind seemed impossible. Radios were checked. No distress calls had been received overnight, no reports of contact, no warning at all. Higher command was notified immediately. Orders came down fast: secure the area, search the forest, find out what happened before nightfall. The missing men were listed as unaccounted for, not captured, not killed, just missing. Search teams moved out in widening arcs, following tracks that became harder to read as the forest thickened. Every snapped twig, every scuffed patch of earth felt like a clue. But the deeper they went, the more confusing the trail became. Footprints split, then vanished, then reappeared somewhere else entirely. By midday, the unease had turned into something heavier. The camp had not been overrun. The men had not fought. They had not run. Whatever happened in that clearing had happened quietly, so quietly that no one outside the trees had noticed a thing. And somewhere in the forest, the truth of that night was still waiting to be found. Because soldiers do not simply disappear, not all at once, not without a reason. And as the search pressed deeper into the woods, the men leading it began to understand something deeply troubling. Whatever took the Americans from that camp had known exactly when to strike, how to move them, and how to leave nothing behind. The night had not been chaotic. It had been precise. And the forest was keeping its secret, for now DB. The forest swallowed sound. As the search teams moved deeper, the world narrowed to damp earth, low branches, and the steady rhythm of boots pressing into mud. Radios crackled softly, then went quiet again. Signals were weak here. The canopy blocked everything: light, sound, certainty. Tracks led forward for several hundred meters, then began to change. They were no longer clustered. Small groups had separated, moving on slightly different paths, all heading roughly in the same direction but never together. There were no drag marks, no signs of struggle, no broken undergrowth that suggested men being forced. Whoever moved them had done it slowly, quietly, and with control. Search leaders halted the advance and studied the ground. Some footprints were clean and deliberate. Others showed hesitation, toes digging in, heels turning slightly sideways, as if men had paused, whispered, then continued on. This was not a rout. It was not panic. It was compliance. That realization spread uneasily through the patrols. German units in the area were experienced, but this was different. Standard night raids relied on speed and violence. This left neither. No blood, no shell casings, no abandoned enemy equipment, nothing that looked like a fight. The forest offered no easy answers. About a kilometer in, the first anomaly appeared. A helmet lay at the base of a tree, upright, undamaged, placed rather than dropped. A few meters away, a rifle leaned against a trunk, safety on. No attempt had been made to hide it. It was as if someone had set it aside. Officers exchanged looks. Soldiers do not abandon weapons unless ordered to, or unless they believe resistance is impossible. The search widened. Scouts pushed farther ahead while others worked laterally, trying to box in the direction of movement. Tracks became fainter as the terrain grew rockier, but they never disappeared entirely. Whoever led the Americans knew the forest well enough to choose ground that erased evidence without losing direction. By late afternoon, tension climbed. The deeper the patrols went, the more exposed they felt. Visibility dropped. Sight lines vanished. Every sound felt closer than it should have been. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt watched. A sudden stop order rippled down the line. Ahead, partially concealed by brush, lay a small clearing. In it were more signs of the missing unit. Packs stacked neatly, canteens grouped together, medical supplies laid out but unused. Nothing was torn, nothing was scattered. The arrangement made no sense for men under threat. This was not a holding area. It was a pause. Someone had stopped the Americans here, organized them, then moved them again. At this point, command made a critical decision. The search would not continue blindly into the forest as night approached. Patrols were pulled back slightly and perimeter positions established. Flares were prepared. Heavy weapons were repositioned to cover likely approaches. No one said it aloud, but everyone felt it. If the Americans had been taken, whoever had taken them was still nearby, and they were confident enough to leave behind signs. As darkness crept in and the forest began to change character once more, the men on the perimeter listened closely, rifles ready, eyes scanning between trees. Somewhere ahead, the night that had swallowed an entire unit was still unfolding, and the longer the forest stayed silent, the clearer one thing became. This disappearance had not been the result of chaos. It had been planned, and whatever had planned it was not finished yet. Night returned to the forest, and with it pressure. Perimeter positions were held until dawn, but no contact came. No probing fire, no movement. Just silence so complete it felt deliberate. At first light, the search resumed, this time more cautiously, more deliberately. Whatever had happened here was not random, and no one wanted to walk into the same trap twice. The trail led uphill. Tracks angled toward higher ground where the forest thinned and rock replaced soil. Footprints became harder to read, but the direction stayed consistent. Whoever led the missing Americans had chosen terrain that slowed pursuit without stopping movement, ground that punished noise and erased mistakes. Then came the first sign of resistance, a single tripwire stretched low between two trees, expertly placed, attached to nothing. No explosive, no flare, just a warning. It was there to be found, to signal that the forest ahead was no longer empty. Search teams halted immediately. This was not a rear guard, it was a message. Scouts pushed forward in pairs, spacing widened, weapons up. The air felt tighter here, thinner. Sight lines were short, and every rock and tree trunk could hide someone waiting. Yet nothing moved, no shots, no voices, just the feeling of being measured. Another discovery followed. A map, folded and weighted with a stone, placed at the edge of a narrow ravine. It was an American map, issued, marked, familiar, but the markings were wrong. Routes were circled that led deeper into the forest, away from friendly lines, away from any known objectives. Someone had altered it, either to mislead or to guide. The implications were unsettling. If the Americans had followed these markings willingly, then they had believed they were being moved to safety. If not, the map was meant for whoever came looking, a way to pull the search farther in. Command ordered a pause. Radio traffic crackled as updates were sent back. Higher headquarters wanted answers, but none were clean. The evidence pointed in opposite directions at once: discipline without violence, movement without panic, control without force. By midday, the forest revealed its next clue. Near a bend in the ravine, shallow depressions had been scraped into the ground. Temporary positions, carefully concealed. Not fighting positions. Rest points. The kind used during controlled movement, where men are told to wait quietly before moving again. There were boot prints inside them. The missing unit had been here, and they had stopped, calmly. No restraints, no signs of coercion, no blood. If this was a capture, it was unlike anything the search teams had seen before. That afternoon, the weather shifted. Wind picked up, carrying distant sounds that could not be placed. A branch snapped somewhere upslope. A stone rolled. Nothing clear enough to fire at, everything clear enough to be felt. Orders came down to pull the search back before dark. Not because the trail had gone cold, but because it was leading somewhere command could no longer control. The forest ahead favored whoever already knew it, and daylight was being spent without answers. As the teams withdrew, one final detail was noticed. At the edge of the ravine, carved shallowly into the bark of a tree, were 3 letters, fresh, crude, not a unit marking, not a symbol, just letters. No one recognized them. They could have meant anything or nothing at all. But the fact that they had been left behind, deliberately visible, suggested intent. Someone wanted the search to know it was close. As night fell again and the patrols regrouped at the perimeter, a new understanding settled in. The Americans had not vanished by accident. They had not been taken in panic. They had been moved, step by step, into terrain chosen for a reason. And whatever waited at the end of that trail had been confident enough to leave breadcrumbs. The forest was no longer just hiding a mystery, it was shaping it. By the 4th day, the search had changed tone. It was no longer about speed, it was about control. Command tightened the perimeter and reorganized the effort into smaller, deliberate elements. No more wide sweeps, no more rushing to follow every clue. The forest ahead was dictating terms, and that was unacceptable. If the missing Americans were alive, time mattered. If they were not, the threat that took them still did. Scouts returned to the ravine at first light. What they found confirmed the growing fear. The ground ahead showed signs of intentional misdirection. False trails branched off toward dead ends. Footprints doubled back, then vanished over bare rock. In several places, tracks abruptly stopped where men had clearly been lifted or guided onto terrain that left no trace. This was not improvisation, it was training. Whoever moved the Americans understood how pursuit worked. They knew what search teams looked for and how to deny it. The forest was being used like a weapon, slowing, confusing, exhausting those who followed. Then came the first human sign. Not a body, a message. Pinned beneath a flat stone near a narrow defile was a torn piece of American ration packaging. On it, scratched with something sharp, were a few words, faint, uneven, but readable. We were told to stay quiet. Nothing else, no signature, no direction, no time. The reaction was immediate. Patrol leaders ordered weapons up and spacing widened. If this was genuine, it meant the Americans had been communicating under supervision or had been allowed to leave something behind intentionally. Neither option was reassuring. The forest closed in tighter beyond that point. Trees grew closer together. The ground rose sharply. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Sound behaved strangely here, bouncing and dying without warning. Several times, scouts froze, convinced they heard movement just beyond sight, only for it to vanish when focused on. Late that afternoon, the search uncovered the first physical evidence of restraint. A length of cord, cut cleanly at one end, lay partially buried near a rock outcrop. Nearby, boot prints showed a sudden change in gait, heels digging in deeper, toes skewed. It was subtle but unmistakable. Someone had resisted here, not violently, briefly. Then the trail continued. Command made a hard call. The search would continue past nightfall. Floodlights were moved forward where possible. Trip flares were set. Heavy weapons were positioned to cover likely approaches. This was no longer just a recovery effort. It was an operation against an unseen enemy operating freely in the dark. As dusk settled, the forest shifted again. Birds went silent. Wind dropped. The air felt heavy, expectant. Patrols reported the same sensation independently, the feeling of being watched from multiple directions at once. Just after full dark, a flare went up unexpectedly, not from the perimeter, but deeper in the woods. It burned white for a few seconds, illuminating trees and rock faces no American patrol had reached yet. Then it went out. No shots followed. No movement revealed itself. Only one message remained clear. Whoever had taken the Americans was still in the forest, and they were no longer hiding. They were controlling when they were seen. The disappearance had escalated into something else entirely, and the men searching the woods now understood a hard truth. They were no longer hunting for answers. They were being tested. The fifth day began with a mistake, a small one, the kind that only becomes obvious afterward. A forward scout stepped off the planned route to check a rock shelf overlooking the ravine. It was a reasonable move, good elevation, natural cover, a place someone trained would use to watch a trail. He signaled, moved 10 meters ahead, and then vanished from sight. No shout, no gunfire, no sound at all. The patrol froze, seconds stretched, then minutes. The radio whispered his call sign once, twice, no answer. When two men eased forward to the edge of the shelf, they found only scuffed dirt and a single boot print that ended abruptly at bare stone. He had been taken, not dragged, not chased, lifted and removed in silence. The search halted immediately. Weapons came up, spacing widened. Every man felt it now, the certainty that the forest was no longer just a place where something had happened. It was an active space, and it was hostile. Command ordered an immediate contraction of the search area. No more solo movement. No more probing beyond visual contact. The missing Americans were no longer the only objective. A new one had emerged. Identify and neutralize whatever was operating in these woods. Tracks appeared again, but not the ones they wanted. Fresh footprints circled the patrol's outer edge, faint but deliberate, placed where they would be noticed only after the fact. In two places, branches had been bent back into position, masking movement paths that had already been used. They were being shadowed. Late that morning, the forest offered another sign, a low whistle, short, controlled, not a bird, not random. It echoed once and stopped. No direction could be pinned down. Patrol shifted covering arcs, expecting contact. None came. Instead, they found something worse. Near a cluster of rocks overlooking the trail, a pack had been left behind. American issue. Inside were personal items, letters, a photograph, a spare pair of socks. At the bottom, folded carefully, was a single piece of paper. It read, "We are still alive." No date, no names. The handwriting was uneven, rushed, but unmistakably American. Morale dipped sharply. Alive meant leverage. Alive meant delay. Alive meant the enemy could dictate terms. Command debated pulling the search out entirely, calling in artillery, clearing the forest by force, but the terrain made that dangerous. The missing men could be anywhere ahead. A single wrong order could kill the very people they were trying to recover. By afternoon, rain began to fall, tracks vanished, sound deadened, visibility dropped to nothing beyond the 30 meters. The forest grew heavier, darker, as if sealing itself. Patrols dug in, holding a defensive posture they had not planned to need. Just before dusk, movement was reported on the ridgeline. Silhouettes, 3, maybe 4. They did not approach. They did not fire. They stood just long enough to be seen, then stepped back into the trees and disappeared. No pursuit followed. Everyone understood the message. The enemy could come and go at will. They were choosing not to. That night, no one slept. The perimeter was tight, weapons ready, fingers numb on triggers. The rain stopped near midnight, and with it came the most unsettling sound yet. Quiet footsteps moving away from the American lines, deeper into the forest. Whoever held the missing unit was relocating, and the search teams were no longer deciding the pace. They were being allowed to follow, or not. By dawn, command faced an impossible choice: press forward and risk losing more men, or pull back and accept that the forest, and whatever ruled it, would keep its prisoners. The disappearance was no longer a mystery, it was a negotiation, and the other side was setting the terms. Command chose to press forward, not because it was safe, but because stopping now would mean surrendering the initiative entirely. If the missing Americans were still alive, every hour mattered. If they were not, whatever controlled this forest would only grow bolder. The search was reorganized into a tight cordon. No more wide patrols, no more exposed scouts. Units moved in overlapping teams, each element always in sight of another, weapons up, spacing disciplined. Progress slowed to a crawl, but control returned, at least on paper. The forest resisted immediately, trails narrowed. The ground rose sharply into broken terrain where movement was noisy and cover was deceptive. Fallen leaves hid slick stone, branches snagged gear, every step demanded attention. The enemy had chosen this ground carefully. By mid-morning, they found where the missing Americans had been taken, a shallow bowl in the earth, hidden from above by tree cover and rock. Not a camp, a holding area. The ground was packed down by many boots. Rope marks were visible on tree trunks at shoulder height. Scratches in the dirt suggested men had sat here for hours, maybe longer. There were no guards in sight, no fortifications, no defensive positions, just absence. Pinned beneath a flat stone in the center of the bowl was another note, written on the back of a field manual page. They said no one would get hurt if we listened. The handwriting was steadier this time. That detail mattered. Whoever had control here was not relying on fear alone. They were offering certainty, a promise of survival in exchange for compliance. That explained the discipline, the silence, the lack of struggle. But certainty in war is always temporary. Scouts reported movement upslope, fleeting, controlled, never close enough to engage. The forest ahead was alive with intent, but no target presented itself. The enemy was staying just beyond reach, shaping movement without exposing position. Then the search lost something else. Radio contact between two American elements dropped out simultaneously. Not static, silence. When runners were sent to reconnect, they found the ground between the units disturbed, but no sign of combat. No bodies, no blood, just missing men, not captured violently, removed. The implication hit hard. This was no longer about one vanished unit. It was spreading. Command ordered an immediate halt and fallback to a tighter defensive perimeter. Heavy weapons were brought forward, flares were prepped. The forest edge was lit and watched through the afternoon, daring the enemy to show itself. They never did. Instead, as evening approached, another object appeared at the edge of the clearing, placed where it could not be missed. An American radio, intact, functional, turned on. It crackled once. Then a voice came through, calm, American, controlled. "We're being moved again. They know where you are." The transmission cut instantly. No trace, no direction, just confirmation. The forest had taken control of the situation completely. Whoever was orchestrating this disappearance was not improvising. They were managing escalation, deciding when to give information, when to take men, when to pull the search deeper, and when to warn it back. As night fell, command made the only decision left. The search would stop at the forest edge. No further advance. No pursuit into ground the enemy clearly dominated. It was not a retreat. It was containment. Because one truth was now unavoidable. The Americans had not vanished into chaos. They had been absorbed into something operating with patience, discipline, and intent. And if the search continued, the forest would not just keep its prisoners, it would take more. The perimeter held through the night, tense and unmoving. Floodlights cut hard cones through the trees, turning trunks into stark pillars and casting long, shifting shadows across the forest floor. Trip flares sat ready, wires taut, fingers resting near triggers. Every sound was examined. Every silence felt deliberate. Nothing crossed the line. At dawn, command assessed what remained. 2 American units were now missing, not scattered, not destroyed, removed. The pattern was undeniable. Whoever controlled the forest understood timing, pressure, and restraint. They took men only when it served a purpose, never enough to provoke blind retaliation, never so few that the message was missed. Aerial reconnaissance was requested. When the photos came back, they raised more questions than answers. Dense canopy concealed almost everything. No camps, no mass movement, no signs of supply trails. The forest looked empty, too empty for what it was hiding. Late that morning, a decision was made that no one wanted to say aloud. Negotiation would be attempted. A controlled radio broadcast was sent on an open frequency, calm and measured. It stated only that the search had halted, that no artillery would be used, and that the missing Americans were to be returned unharmed. There was no immediate response. Hours passed. Then, just before noon, a flare rose from deep within the forest, white, steady, unmistakable. It burned, fell, and disappeared without a sound. Minutes later, the radio crackled. A different voice this time, still American, older, tired. "They told us you'd stop looking if we proved it." Proved what was not asked. No one interrupted. "We're alive. They haven't hurt anyone. They said this ends when you leave the woods." The transmission cut. No coordinates, no instructions, no opportunity to respond. The meaning was clear enough. The forest was not being contested. It was being leased, temporarily, and the terms had just been set. Command argued briefly, sharply, and then not at all. Every option beyond compliance risked the lives of men they now knew were alive. The perimeter was ordered to stand down gradually. Heavy weapons were pulled back. Floodlights were shut off one by one. By late afternoon, American forces had withdrawn to the last defensible line outside the trees. They waited. As dusk fell, movement appeared at the forest edge. Slow, unarmed, careful. One by one, figures emerged from between the trees. They were the missing Americans. Exhausted, dirty, shaken, but alive. They carried no weapons. None of them spoke until they were well clear of the tree line. Medics moved in immediately, checking for injuries, dehydration, shock. There were no visible wounds beyond bruises and exhaustion. When asked what had happened, the answers were fragmented. They woke us up. They spoke English. They knew our ranks. They said no one needed to die. No one could explain who they were taken by, only how. They had been surrounded silently in the dark, disarmed without violence, moved in small groups, always watched, always guided, never beaten, never threatened, just controlled, until control was no longer needed. When the last man cleared the tree line, the forest went quiet again. No pursuit followed. No celebration sounded from within. Whatever had lived there had gotten exactly what it wanted. The Americans were gone, and the forest closed behind them, untouched, unchallenged, and undefeated. The men were alive, but they were not the same. Medical checks continued through the night. Dehydration, exposure, shock, bruises from being moved in the dark, no broken bones, no obvious signs of torture. That fact alone unsettled everyone. This had not been a rescue from captivity, it had been a release. Interviews began at first light, separately, quietly, carefully. The stories matched in ways that were impossible to coordinate. They had been woken without noise, surrounded before they understood what was happening. Disarmed by hands they never saw clearly, the voices had been calm, American accents, different ages, different tones. Whoever led them knew names, ranks, even small details that should not have been known, who had guard duty, who was sick, who carried the radio. They said resistance would get someone else hurt, one man said. Not me, someone else. That was the key. Control without violence works only if fear is redirected. The Americans had been moved in short stages, always at night, always along routes chosen to erase tracks. They were given water, occasionally food, never enough to relax, always enough to comply. At rest points, they were told to sit, stay quiet, and wait. No restraints most of the time, no blindfolds, just proximity and certainty. They said the woods were theirs for one night, another man said, and that everyone else would live if we listened. Command cross-checked everything. No German units were reported in the area, no known resistance cells matched the pattern, no Allied special operations had missions logged anywhere near that forest. The accents bothered everyone the most. Too American, too familiar. This was not an enemy force trying to win ground. It was a group trying to shape behavior, to stop a search without starting a firefight, to remove pressure without leaving evidence, to prove capability and then withdraw. And they had succeeded. Orders came down to seal the reports. No public mention, no speculation outside command channels, no follow-up operations into the forest. The missing men were reassigned quietly. Some were sent home. Others transferred units. None were allowed back into the sector. The forest was marked as a low-priority zone and avoided thereafter, despite its obvious tactical value. It was easier to go around. As days passed, the urgency faded, but the questions did not. Who had planned it? Why go to such lengths to avoid bloodshed? And why leave messages instead of none at all? The answers never came. No further contact occurred. No new disappearances followed. No signs of occupation were ever confirmed. The forest returned to silence, the kind that feels earned. Among the men who had been taken, sleep came hard. Night noises triggered reflexes. Being told to wait carried weight it never had before. None of them could fully explain what had frightened them most, because fear had not been the point, certainty had been. And certainty, when it comes from someone who can take you without firing a shot, lingers longer than terror ever could. Whatever had moved through that forest did not want a battle. It wanted control, and it had shown, beyond doubt, that it could take it and give it back whenever it chose. In the weeks that followed, the forest became a place no one talked about and no one entered. Orders were never written that said, "Do not go there." They didn't need to be. Routes were adjusted quietly, patrol paths bent away from the tree line, artillery plans excluded the area without explanation. On maps, the forest remained blank, untouched by symbols or notes, as if nothing there required attention. That absence was deliberate. Intelligence officers tried to reconstruct what had happened using reports, interviews, and timelines. They laid out maps on tables, marked movement windows, plotted distances the Americans had been moved during the night. The conclusion they reached was uncomfortable. Whoever had taken control of the forest had done so with minimal manpower. No supply trails were found, no long-term camps detected, no evidence of a force large enough to dominate the area for days, which meant the control had not come from numbers. It had come from confidence and precision. The men who were taken described the same thing again and again. They were never rushed, never shouted at, never threatened with immediate harm. Instructions were given calmly, often before questions could be asked. Resistance was discouraged not with violence but with information, details about the search, about positions outside the forest, about what would happen next if cooperation stopped. They always seemed one step ahead, one soldier said, like they already knew what we were going to do. That detail stayed with intelligence officers the longest. It suggested preparation far beyond an opportunistic ambush. This had been planned with knowledge of American procedures, reaction patterns, and command behavior. The forest had not been chosen randomly. The timing had not been accidental. The disappearance had been designed, and just as deliberately it had been ended. No demands were made, no propaganda followed, no attempt was made to exploit the event publicly. The Americans were returned alive, unharmed enough to fight again, but shaken in ways no report could measure. That outcome forced command into an uncomfortable position. Any aggressive response risked provoking a repeat. Any investigation risked more men disappearing. So the decision was made to let the forest stand, not as enemy territory, not as friendly ground, but as a boundary. For the men who had been taken, the boundary was internal. They returned to duty, but something had shifted. Orders were followed as before, but waiting felt different. Silence carried weight. When told to hold position overnight, some found themselves scanning trees longer than necessary, listening not for movement, but for coordination. The fear was not of being attacked, it was of being managed again. Years later, when the war was over and questions could be asked more freely, the forest still refused to give up answers. Local civilians claimed nothing unusual had happened. Resistance groups denied involvement. German records showed no operations there. Allied files remained sealed or incomplete. The incident slipped into obscurity, not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't fit. Wars are built around violence, capture, destruction. This event had relied on none of those. It had disrupted operations, forced a withdrawal, and reshaped movement in an entire sector, without a single confirmed shot fired during the disappearance itself. That made it harder to explain than a massacre. Among historians who later studied fragmentary records, the consensus was cautious but clear. The Americans had encountered a group whose objective was not victory, territory, or casualties. It had been demonstration. A message delivered once, cleanly and never repeated. The forest did not need to take more men. It had already proven it could. The forest was never marked on any official map, not as hostile, not as secured, not even as noteworthy. It simply became a place that operations flowed around, quietly, without discussion, without explanation. Routes bent away from it. Patrols stopped short of the tree line. Artillery plans skipped over it as if nothing there was worth firing at. And that was the point. The incident never received a formal name. There was no battle, no engagement, no citation written for bravery or loss. What happened did not fit the language of war as it was meant to be recorded. No exchange of fire, no prisoners taken in the traditional sense, no ground seized, just an entire American unit removed from the battlefield and then returned, alive. For command, that outcome was both a relief and a warning. The men were back, but the certainty of control had been challenged in a way no conventional attack ever could. Someone had demonstrated that they could enter an American perimeter, neutralize it completely, manage the response, and end the situation on their own terms. That kind of capability did not need repetition. The forest had spoken once. The men who had vanished carried that understanding with them long after the war ended. They rarely talked about the details, not because they had been sworn to secrecy, but because words failed. How do you explain being taken without being hurt, threatened without being struck, controlled without chains? How do you explain certainty delivered calmly in the dark? They remembered the discipline of their captors more than anything else, the way movements were timed, the way instructions came before panic could set in, the way resistance was discouraged by knowledge rather than force. Whoever had done this understood soldiers, how they think, how they react, how they obey when outcomes are framed carefully. That realization stayed. Years later, when veterans gathered and stories were shared, this one surfaced only occasionally, usually late, usually in low voices. It never ended with a punchline or a moral. It ended with silence, the kind that comes when everyone listening understands the implication. Wars are usually remembered for violence. This incident was remembered for restraint. No shots fired in anger. No blood spilled in panic. No bodies left behind to explain what had happened. Just a missing unit, a halted search, and a forest that was never entered again. Historians who later stumbled across partial records struggled with it. Some dismissed it as confusion, misreporting, exaggerated fear. Others suggested secret operations that were never acknowledged. None could fully reconcile the facts without inventing details that did not exist. And perhaps that is why the truth endured only among those who were there. Because what happened that night was not meant to be understood by everyone. It was meant to be understood by the people who mattered. The message was simple, precise, and delivered only once. You can search, you can surround, you can escalate. But here, in this forest, control does not belong to you. The Americans were allowed to leave. The forest was left alone, and the war moved on, shaped slightly, quietly, by an encounter that proved something rare and unsettling. That sometimes the most powerful force on a battlefield is not the one that destroys, but the one that demonstrates it doesn't need to.